Anyone who works outside of a major city or has ever tried to get work done while on a trip to a more rural location knows that rural connectivity can be patchy.
Despite the UK's high population density and relative lack of difficult terrain, rural connectivity remains an uneven picture. Many rural businesses are still struggling to receive fibre optic cables, let alone leverage 5G signals to keep up with the demands of modern business.
Is UK connectivity improving, and how far have we still got to go? You're listening to the IT Pro podcast. Hi, I'm Jane McCallion.
And I'm Rory Bathgate.
Today we're speaking to David Happy, Non-Executive Director at Jet Connectivity and Non-Executive Chairman at Transport for Wales, Fibre, and Colin Wood, Innovation Lead at Dorset Council, to unpack the state of rural connectivity in the UK. David, Colin, welcome.
Thank you. Hello.
So, a nice easy start to the conversation. What is the current state of UK connectivity?
Well, it's from a rural perspective, slightly frustrating, I think. We had the Telecommunications Act right back in 1984. Enshrined in it and in the subsequent 2003 Act was always the desire to try to avoid two tiers of connectivity quality. It's not just enough to have coverage, we want capacity as well. It was never the intention, I don't think, on the part of anybody to end up in a situation where rural was lagging quite considerably behind urban. But unfortunately, that's where we're at. And two things, certainly on the mobile side, the recent 3G switch off has actually meant coverage has been slightly worse. And I'm going to hand over to Colin to explain a little bit on that. And of course, within BD UK, that program has also had some impact to the good, but perhaps not as much as we might have liked. Colin, you had some specifics on that, I think.
Yeah, we've got one of the most elderly populations in the UK. And clearly, a lot of our technologies to support those older people are built around cellular technologies and traditionally have used 2G and 3G signals. Obviously, if that signal is repurposed for very good reason, but disappears from a particular location, that can be a real problem for local authorities. So, yeah, something that we're kind of conscious is done for the right reasons, but in the short term is leading to some difficulties. So those are the kinds of issues we face in rural locations, but probably in urban ones as well. So.
Yeah, I mean, there's another one as well. And I think there's good intent on everybody's part to try to fix this. But if it was easily fixable, we'd have fixed it 40 years ago, because that's the number we're talking about. BD UK, for example, even after that work has finished in Dorset, there'll be roughly 80,000 prems that don't have adequate connectivity. And that's really a problem. The last thought I'd leave you with, look at how on the regulatory side things have lagged. I think it was only from memory 2017, 2018 that we had a broadband universal service obligation of a whopping 2 megabits. Before that, I can remember a universal service obligation for a switch telephony line at 64 kilobit. And I'm willing to vouchsafe that I think current capacity statistics, most people will easily be using hundreds of megabits today. And we want to do the same in rural areas, just like people can in urban ones. And I don't see any technical reason why we can't.
We'll come back to the 3G element, but looking at the kind of the infrastructure side of things, the capacity side of things, this can be a problem in rural areas. One of the things about not just England, but the UK is that you can go from a urban environment to a very rural environment incredibly quickly. Is this is it connected to some of the wider issues around investment in infrastructure more broadly in rural areas? Like, it's a lot easier to lay broadband cable when you're digging up a road. If you're not digging up the roads, then you don't really have that opportunity to just do everything all at the same time. Are these two, is there a link there, or am I barking up the wrong tree?
Well, I think I got the question, but I might put it slightly differently.
Okay.
And I phrased it along the lines of, well, what is the problem here? There clearly is one. And what you're talking about is key to the Invest 2035 green paper, which we can come on to in due course if you wish. But essentially, there are two variables here. One of them is the cost to build a network. It's going to cost what it's going to cost to build and to operate it. The next one is, how much revenue can you extract from that network? And is there an element of trade-off between the two, and can you stack additional revenues in to make more money? So that's at the core of the problem, and it's been the same problem on and off for 40 years. It's just, how do we optimize that? So, we've done some innovative things, including, we took particular heed of the minister's comments at Connected Britain relating to things like track to train. And I think, Colin, you've been doing some work on the train side, haven't you?
Yeah, we've been doing a really interesting project with support from Department for Science, Innovation and Technology. And hopefully we have created certainly the UK's first Wi-Fi connected steam train. Maybe the world's first. We can't find another one, but I don't want to make that claim unless I'm 100% certain. But yeah, this is essentially a project to provide passengers on the Swanage Railway with connectivity as they pass through the beautiful Purbeck Dorset countryside. Lovely project, but obviously done for a very, very kind of broader reason, which is, can you connect a vehicle, something that's moving, using low Earth orbit satellites and cellular connectivity? And if you can do that on a train, could you do it, in a fleet of cars that deliver social care to elderly people in very rural locations? So how can we use those technologies to deliver our services, in a more future-proof way, in a more efficient way, and let's face it, in a cheaper way, because local authorities across the UK are up against it in terms of their finances. So yeah, interesting project, and done for hopefully broader reasons than just a steam train, but it is a nice story.
And also probably worth mentioning Wi-Fi 6, and with a view to looking at upgrading to Wi-Fi 7 once we can get equipment at prices that look more reasonable than they are today, because obviously bonding of frequencies would mean that we could begin to deliver some serious capacity. And I'd mentioned just in passing, in Wales, we've been looking at what we might be able to do with millimetre wave, because now that we have trackside fibre throughout the core valley lines, that's a really useful thing. And if you put that knowledge together with what Dorset's doing, then we begin, Jane, to tackle your question, because there is a circularity in the relationship between urban and the rural. There always has been. If you want to keep eating in London, you better keep making sure we drive our tractors in Dorset. It's really quite simple. So I think that's an important angle. The stackable use cases is still an issue, but I think we should focus a little bit on the costs to build these networks. So discussions around neutral hosts, fibre and water. If only we could have got the Drinking Water Inspectorate to approve something a couple of years ago, we'd have been able to look at something in that domain. But I think they were concerned about the age of the plant that they have, and they were worried about the health quality side of that. And I accept that. I noticed that it's been deployed in at least 10 other countries in the world. I also note that the patents were all from the UK. So kind of sad that sometimes tech comes up that you can't exploit that would have helped a rural area. But, you can't win them all, I suppose.
I love what's going on with the Swanage Railway, and that you talk about future-proofing, Colin, using a, kind of very, I suppose it's antiquated technology at this point. Nice, because I've been down to Didcot as well. So but it is it strikes me though that it's a good example, just kind of more broadly, of how you can do something that is innovative and quirky to make a point and to show how something really can work, even if it's not necessarily something that you're going to replicate across the entire rail network.
Yeah, so we've talked about disseminating the learnings across other heritage railway networks in the UK, but that's kind of missing the point in a way. It's how do you transfer the learnings and the technology to other moving things in a rural context using the technology that's available to us today, whether that's cellular technology or the latest generation of satellites. So interesting stuff, but kind of not really about trains, as you say. It is about a train in this case, but could be about social care vehicles, could be about bin lorries, could be about anything that moves that needs a connection to be stable enough to do something interesting. And in a rural context, that could be anything from vehicles moving to something that's static, actually, like a wind farm. We think about rural locations, and a lot of the things that urban locations depend on to survive, like sustainable energy, are not done in urban environments. They're done in rural contexts. So the connectivity, is needed in the rural context, almost more than, if not as much as, in an urban context. So.
And I wonder how easy it would be. I know it's not as easy as it seems, but if you think of the number of terabits of submarine cables that flow between Cornwall and London, If only I could have a couple of them for myself, I'd be really happy. And all my farms would be really well connected along that particular part of the route. If only we'd have got the chambers in earlier. No, still never mind. I think the other thing to mention with the train stuff, clearly, safety must always be paramount. Nobody must ever be placed in any kind of risk or in any kind of danger. So intelligently thinking about what equipment can be sited where is very important. And if we're able to make sure that we could put up a mast that's safe and secure and that might be able to, for example, not only face up and down the track, not only receive satellite services, but have a fixed radio access connectivity that serves the local old folks home or the local tank museum, Bovington being an example. I'm thinking of real places here. We can see cheaper ways of filling that gap where there's those 80,000 premises that are unserved by BDUK.
I desperately want to mention, well, I'm mentioning it now, rural bus services and the possible for connectivity. But before we're going to go very far down Jane's special interest route if we carry on going this way.
I was going to say, I think the image of the train is also something that will resonate with most people in the UK. You know, especially getting it working on a steam train is kind of a good thing to light fire under innovators, because most people have been in a situation where the train Wi-Fi just doesn't work, and it's a great kind of symbol for the connectivity failure that we are seeing that you've been describing. I was wondering, David, if you could explain a little bit more about fibre and water, and then we can talk a little bit more about LEO satellites as well. But just for those who don't know, what are the main benefits of it, and what is it an alternative to?
Sure. Fibre and water, I think today would be more of a niche technology, particularly well suited to rural areas. And the concept would be that you've got this inert glass fiber inside a polytube, which therefore isn't going to, everything is fully inert. So the idea would be, since everybody has mains water, wouldn't it be great if the mains water infrastructure in the United Kingdom, in particular in rural areas, was capable of safely making this deployment work? Now, it appears in other countries where the core network of the water industry is perhaps more modern than it is in the UK, that it's much easier for them. Now, given that we've got all kinds of mixtures of iron, lead, and goodness only knows what else there, I'm sure that in some cases the water companies are probably wondering sometimes exactly what might be there, because it might have been there for a considerable number of years. And I have sympathy and I respect that. But I was very surprised because there was a call that I think it was on the DCMS days. And we did look at doing some tests in Dorset to see whether or not that would be a quick and easy way to get fibre to really remote locations. You know, I'm thinking in Wales, Sennybridge, clearly in Dorset, we've got a huge amount of area, Lulworth Ranges, places where this technology could really help people really quickly. And it's easy to get it into the tubes and to get it to serve end users. But the technology never really took off. Not that it doesn't have a role. I think in the access network, it very much does still have a role, but the numbers of places that are going to now require it are going to be reducing slowly with time. And by the time that the UK's plant will be perhaps suitably resilient to cope with it, I think the opportunity may have already gone. And I believe the company that held the patents, I don't think is UK owned anymore, which is a terrible sadness. Because, you know, we do all this work, we come up with all this innovation in the UK. Time after time, there's people like Colin and I doing our Heath Robinson bit on the train, trying to find cheap, sensible, practical ways to get common sense solutions out to the people that we're there to serve and help. And it's really frustrating sometimes. I think fibre and water fits into the really frustrating category for us. I wish, but the boat has sailed.
I was just wondering, this kind of taking us back a little bit to an earlier part of the conversation, if part of the problem here, you know, just is return on investment. A lot of the infrastructure that is laid in terms of fibre in this country, if not all of it, is privately done. That's, you know, for better or worse. If you are laying fibre out to one of the villages that I know in sort of, you know, South Wiltshire, North Dorset, where you've got a couple of hundred people live there, and obviously, you know, most of those are families, so you've got like 25 to 50 houses, getting back the money that it's going to take to put that infrastructure in is going to take a really, really long time. And there is no guarantee that whoever it was who laid it will be the ones who get finally break even down the line. Is there anything that can be done to square this circle, either incentivize private companies to lay better infrastructure into truly rural areas, or somehow compensate them for doing so?
Yes, I think there is. We saw the beginnings, or we've seen the beginnings in the past few years of local authority in co-invested fibre optic spines. Okay, I can think of about a dozen. Liverpool, Stoke, spring immediately to mind. I think historically there may have been one in Colchester. And these were areas where there was evident market failure. I know Surrey and Hampshire looked at one through their LEP, but as a result of the LEP being abolished, the thing never actually happened. That would have happened because it was agreed, and part of the funding was contributed by the then MHCOG, Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government. Now, also, I look at Sweden and I see, for example, in the greater Stockholm area, that the local authorities, the municipalities actually own the fibre. Now, there's no rule that says if somebody's not willing to make the commercial investments or don't think that the returns are adequate, that we should not be thinking about looking at this in the context of market failure. Clearly, BDUK is putting public money in a certain way, but fibre optic spines, I think, could provide an enormous help. And not only that, especially if you can look at other coastal areas, because we may be increasingly in the future having to deploy more submarine fibre cables, because it seems that lots of people keep trawling them and digging them up. That affects the UK's resilience for its whole internet infrastructure. And guess what? Those cables always land on a beach, and Dorset's got some really good beaches. There has to be a way to try to think about this. Direct burial, I believe, was trialled by BT back in the day. I think even the Isle of Wight had direct burial. I think there's direct burial of some stuff in Dorset. There's less deep digs. There are ways to address this, but at the end of the day, if we don't make it a lot easier for people to do it, it's not going to happen. And on the evidence, Jane, in the last 40 years, it simply hasn't happened enough. And there is a role for the state in here. There has to be. And that you don't see that clearly coming out, I don't think, yet in the Invest 2035 strategy, which is a bit sad, really. I think the intent was there, and I think it might change. It's only a green paper, but that they're in that process might lie the answer to this question.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the Invest 2035 green paper that you've mentioned? Because I'm sure some of our listeners won't be quite familiar with it.
Sure. I mean, clearly it's occupied me quite considerably. When I first read it, my impressions were that it hadn't really been looked at that closely by someone from a telecom and internet background, but that the general strategic objectives were sound. So, for example, I'll give you a couple of key statistics. Telecoms is mentioned twice in the whole document. Once is in a graph, once is in a footnote. There's no mention of the word cyber that I could find, and yet it was in the King's speech. Spectrum, there's no mention of spectrum. Is spectrum pricing even relevant in a world where we no longer want to have a solution that isn't deep fiber and where higher frequencies don't cause harmful interference? So the rationing effect that justified it has been undermined. That's a thought. The other thing I think I would flag up in this, there are two statements, because that sounds like they didn't even think about communications. Well, that's not entirely true. But the two things I picked up, and one of them was the words on page 34 somewhere, I think it said, infrastructure underpins all economic activity by connecting people, goods, services, energy and ideas. Well, they're not connecting them in some rural points right now, so we'd welcome that. The second quote was, the core objective of the industrial strategy is unleashing the full potential of our cities and regions. So, for example, wouldn't it be great if I could get on my train in Dorset, right, and have a good sustainable signal all the way to Cardiff Central? Why not? Why are we making this so difficult? What people want is good coverage and good connectivity, and they want it. It's not a case of either or. And when I hear mobile networks sometimes say, well, we've got some coverage there, well, I respect them. They've got a massive job to do. It's a difficult job, and I don't envy them. But I want capacity too. I want to be on an even footing with everybody. And just because my village happens to be called a train and it happens to move between 2 points, are we seriously saying that in 2025 we don't have the capability to address this technical problem? I rather think we do. My rant is over, and I suppose I would leave it to Colin to draw a thread on, What could you sum that up as in one word? How would we do that? One sentence that looks at what I'm trying to say, Colin. I can't find the words.
I mean,
this is a PG show, Colin, before you go ahead.
So I echo what Dave says about the document, Invest 2035, support the thrust a bit. I thought there was a lot of good stuff in there. Disappointed to see the lack of telecoms and digital infrastructure mentioned. We want that to be, at the heart, not just a part of that strategy. However, ambitions are great, saying that we want to support these sectors and saying that, we want to support the regional economies of the UK is fantastic. But, in a place with no motorways, we need those digital motorways to be able to do that. And we just don't have those at the moment. The GVA, the kind of economic growth that we've experienced in Dorset over the last 10 years is quite frankly pitiful. And that's down to the fact we have quite a lot of old people, but it's also down, I believe, to the fact that the infrastructure that we have here to support economic growth is just not adequate for what we need today. And, I think if this strategy is to become, a real living thing that happens over the next 10, 20, 30 years, we're going to have to address that as a nation.
And there's one other really super quote I picked up from this, and I led on it in some of the response work I got involved with. And it said on page 23 that half of global trade is expected to be digital by 2050. So if half of global trade is going to be digital by 2050, and we're a trading nation, it logically follows that we need to be putting a considerable part of our efforts into addressing digital infrastructure, because if we can't, we're not going to be able to participate in that global trade effectively. That undermines our economic future. So it's even bigger than just rural. So I think what I see there, I see seeds of hope. I guess it's a great rural analogy. I see great potential. I think people are trying to think about some form of information strategy, much like Korea had, something that is a long term, not 20 minutes, but 20 years, looking sensibly at a sustainable future. So we can get the UK involved in standards. We can look at the optimal spectrum solutions. We can play an active part in AI and all the other developments that are coming forward. And we can use the natural creativity of these islands to do great stuff in agri-tech. And as we've been doing in Dorset. And what we constantly end up doing is always we do it with as little money as possible on a small scale, and we then fight and do our best to make it happen. I guess Pink Floyd, crying out in quiet desperation, is just the English way, that it's so frustrating sometimes, because this is a nation of greatness, of great people, of great inventions, of the internet itself, of submarine cables, of the origin of the telephone itself. And yet here we are, trying to have a discussion about how to make sure that people can have a basic service, which frankly should be their right.
Colin, there's something that you've mentioned a couple of times that I wanted to reflect on, which is the sort of aging Dorset population and the phenomenon of younger people leaving rural areas to go and find work in urban areas is a common phenomenon. It's well known. And I wonder how much of that is driven by the fact that, say you are a younger person, the kind of person who is going to set up your own business or join a smaller business, how much there not being the connectivity that you can get in our urban areas is going to be a barrier to you wanting to do that in the place where you grew up.
Yeah, it's one of the main things that occupies the minds of our councillors, the people who run the council. We had a change of administration quite recently, and got a new corporate plan, and it talks about wanting to keep our young people in the locale. So in order for that to happen, there have to be a number of different things. You need to have a job to go to. You need to have an interesting job that's going to occupy you, is going to make the use of the skills that you've learned during your education. And we're trying to make some changes around that, trying to change the focus of the Dorset economy from one that's built around perhaps agriculture and tourism to one that's built around the idea that you can run a successful business that's innovating and producing niche and boutique products and services. Because if you have the digital infrastructure available to you, you can do that from anywhere, essentially. So that's kind of part of the story we're trying to tell as a county. But yeah, long term, yes, what we see is people from young people from Dorset going to university, getting a great education, because our universities are the best in the world, as we know, and then they go where the jobs are, or they stay where they've been educated. And We don't have a university in our part of Dorset. We certainly have one in Bournemouth, but that's not our part of Dorset. So what we really want to achieve is people either going to university and then coming back here to live and work and pay taxes, let's be honest, to support local services and pay for the care for those elderly people that we talk about. Or they come back here and actually set up their own business because they've got the connectivity and the infrastructure that enables them to do that. And they start to employ more local people, and then you get that circular economy that hopefully is self-generating and self-fulfilling. So, yeah.
I think there's another thing that may be useful to mention on a current DSIT-funded program with Dorset Open Network Ecosystem activities. I'm actually responsible for mentoring an undergraduate student from the University of Exeter, which is my own alma mater, so happy days and home territory for me, specifically with a view to making sure that she has the skills and access to knowledge and experience early in her career that will maybe help her to assist to stay in the area, to have the knowledge and the network, to see what we're doing. This is the second time. We did the same in 5G Rural Dorset, had a fantastic lady called Daisy. The new lady is called Jocelyn Knapp. I think she's recently released a little blog on this. And what we'd like to do is to try to persuade DSIT to change the rules when they fund grant funding programs to simply say that 1% of the available budget that's awarded could be donated to funding a student, and then forcing people, the grizzly old people like me, and incidentally to me, Colin still is a young person, by the way, but forcing us to go out, reach out to our local universities, and instead of offering them yet another training course, let them see what really goes on. Let them do it on their terms. Let them do it on ways that fit with their working diaries because they have degrees to pass. But step back and make it a friendly experience because the UK has a skills deficit, which is terrible. But who wouldn't want to work in Dorset? If what Colin and I can successfully achieve is better fibre coverage in Dorset and better radio coverage in Dorset, and we might do that through tourism, we might do it through the Ministry of Defence, work we've been doing on the Battle Lab down in Dorset and the fantastic developments and sales opportunities for great businesses at the Dorset Innovation Park. Had to get that one in, Colin. It's something that we can do, and we are making a difference. We can't do that for every young person, but DSIT, if they change the rules of these competitions in the grant funding agreements, would simply have a line that said, 1% of that now goes, find a student, find a university, find a young person that you as a group can help, adopt that young person, and you suddenly find it might not be one. So we adopted Daisy on our previous program. Her flatmate now works for Jet Connectivity, and Jet Connectivity, which was a startup itself, proving that UK innovation does happen, has its roots in Dorset, and that's now got 30 odd employees. And I can tell you with complete certainty that all bar one of them are much younger than me.
I guess there's one other thing I'd like to say on that, which is there's a little bit about inspiring and opening the eyes of our young people to what is actually on their doorstep and what potentially they could achieve by staying at home. Not everybody wants to go to university. So we do a lot of work around highlighting the potential of career in STEM with primary school children, actually taking them to locations in Dorset and giving them experiences with local companies. So I'd like to shout out to people like XNet and Atlas Electronic and the MOD locally, who essentially make it interesting and fun for them to say, okay, I didn't realize this thing was on my doorstep. I now do. And that might change one person's mind out of a class of 30 about, whether they follow, the traditional route into, being a job that's very essential, but something that's quite traditional, or whether they perhaps look at a different career going forwards, especially people with who face challenges in traditional educational settings. We find a lot of people who, perhaps slightly autistic and on the spectrum, they have many of the skills that local companies that are working in digital and cyber security kind of environments really value. And we've tried to foster that in Dorset, and hopefully that will reap benefits into the future. So.
Colin, something you've mentioned several times now, you mentioned it when we were talking about the train in particular, is LEO, low Earth orbit satellites. When we last spoke on the podcast, David, I think we spoke a little bit about Starlink. Obviously, Starlink has massively expanded since then. Amazon is expanding its Project Kuiper constellation, and the EU is looking at launching its own LEO constellation as well. I guess, what is the benefit of low Earth orbit satellites? How usable is this? Some people might know of businesses that use Starlink already, perhaps smaller businesses in extremely remote areas. But does it have a more day-to-day use as well?
Yes, certainly. We've been using satellite technology for some years in some of our projects, and we've mentioned the Wi-Fi connected steam train. So what we're doing on that project is essentially blending the available cellular network connectivity with low Earth orbit satellite connectivity, and picking the best of both worlds, if you like. So using Starlink for providing connectivity on platform and in car parks around sort of the places where people get on the trains, but we'll be using the OneWeb technology on the actual train itself, so we can compare and contrast between the different services that are currently available. It's one of our, hopefully we're quite proud of it. It's hopefully one of our firsts, and we'll be doing more work on that later on this year. But hopefully we can translate that quirky use case into one that can inform the decisions at a national level about how we connect trains going forwards, which I know is something that Dave's been working on in the background with his other role.
Yeah, actually, thanks, Colin. One of the things that's troubled me about this is, a village on the move is the concept, the way that I look at it. And we did look at a village in South Wales, about 250 to 300 people. And when they were allowed to have unmetered access, they were typically consuming about 1.5 gig. So is there pent up demand? Yes. I then wonder, and I've not seen any research on this, right? If your bum's sitting on a seat on a train, your ability to be distracted by anything else, like the fact the kettle's just boiled over in the kitchen, or the children are screaming, or whatever it might be, the wallpaper's peeling off and you suddenly got an overwhelming urge to fix it that actual second. Surely there's a potential that people would actually want to use connectivity even more intensively. And then I looked at the state of the UK's frequency allocation table, and mid-band spectrum is pretty damn hard to find. And what we're going to be moving into this new, and I'm not going to use the other G word, we know the one that comes after 5 because I'm not even sure it's appropriate. What I'm going to do is say, we are going to be sharing spectrum more. So one of the things of interest is, who might we be able to share spectrum with in a rural area to greater effect? And for the trains, could we find a way that I could do my call from Cardiff down to Dorchester South via lots of changes and through all the cuttings and what have you? Would it work on satellite alone? No. But if it didn't, and I'd electrified the line, the thing that's always held back good train connectivity in rural areas has been the difficulty of doing it cost efficiently. Well, as fibre begins to extend across other parts of Network Rail Telecom on a larger scale, I'm lucky. My Core Valley lines in Wales are already fibered up, 170 kilometres, bang, done. So in that zone, I could, in theory, deploy millimetre wave tomorrow, right? And then I could look at probably approaching 10 gig and more to a train. And the current Ofcom approved frequencies, I think, are, I think it's 60 gig and 71 E-band, something like that from memory. So is that equipment available? Yes. Are there UK vendors? Yes. Does that improve sovereign capability in line with UK desires to have more supply chain resilience? Answer, yes. Do people want it? Clearly, yes. Would it encourage more people? Would it mean they wouldn't have to travel as much? In some cases it would, but on balance, people will always want to travel. People are increasingly being forced to go back to work, and therefore the situation is getting quite urgent. So to my mind, I think in the next 2 to 3 years, we will see a greater more initiative in this space, but it comes down to who's going to pay for it. Guess what? It's the same old problem what we did at the start. Costs to build and operate a network, revenues available. We've been here before, haven't we, folks?
We've discussed lots of different solutions here, and we've also talked a bit about some specific dates by which people hope things will get better. So 2035 has been mentioned a lot. In the next few years, if you're a rural business in the UK, is there real hope on the horizon for your connectivity improving?
I think we always have to have hope, but I would go back to the point that the majority of people who live in rural locations like Dorset, certainly in Dorset, don't have full fibre. Many of them don't even have very good copper provided connectivity, and that needs to change. Satellite offers an option. We know of people who buy a £75 a month Starlink connection because that's essentially all that they can do. But that can't become the norm, I don't think. And I think fibre always has to be what we aim for, because there has to be equity of access. If we're going to deliver what the government says it wants to deliver, I think equity of access is basically where we need to point ourselves at, because anything else is a compromise, and we shouldn't be settling for compromises.
So to the question, should we have hope? Is there hope? Yes, I'm an eternally hopeful individual. I might be old, but I haven't lost the desire to make all of this happen. And for as long as there are people like Colin and I about that are determined enough, crazy enough, and stubborn enough to fight through all of the stuff that has to be done, wade through masses of government documents, and actually still in our hearts genuinely care about this stuff, then there has to be a future. We will be sharing more radio. Neutral hosting will come in some form. Even if it's not fibre in water, fibre will be increasingly deeply deployed. And I'll just leave you with one thing that I don't think will happen, though, and this is from the 2035 Green Paper. And it specifically says continued investment is needed to meet our ambitious targets to bring gigabit-capable broadband to all of the UK and standalone 5G to all populated areas by the year 2030. And I'd just like to close, given that we're talking about rural, standalone 5G to all populated areas, doesn't really ring quite so nicely with all the other bits that we were talking about and the comments about place in the document. Because, sorry, the last time I checked, we want connectivity, we want coverage, and we want capacity too. And as for standalone 5G by 2030, I think in the current economic climate, I admire their ambition. I want to give them hope too. I will help them to get there, but it ain't going to be an easy ride. But keep hoping, guys, and don't be afraid to invest in Dorset, because if you come, we'll find a way to do it. And when you want to use your train in Wales, you will find that connectivity will improve, because we will make it so. Determination is everything.
Well, unfortunately, that's all we have time for today, but David, Colin, thank you so much for joining us. As always, you can find links to all of the topics we've spoken about today in the show notes, and even more on our website at itpro.com.
You can also follow us on LinkedIn, as well as subscribe to our daily newsletter. Don't forget to subscribe to the IT Pro podcast wherever you find podcasts. And if you're enjoying the show, let us know by leaving a rating or a review.
We'll be back next week with more from the world of IT. But until then, goodbye.
Goodbye.